Hey everybody, this is Garrett with Earth and Time, and today I'm coming to you from Presidio La Bahía, and I'm actually going to talk about geology today, not just history or the history of this place. I do have another video on that history, and I will link that down in the description below, or you can search that on my channel. But what I want to do is talk about the importance of the material used in making this fort and how geology plays such an important and central role to history. So with that being said, come join me today. Let's learn about the geology and the rocks that actually make up the Presidio La Bahía. Let's get to it. Now, interesting enough, if you ever look at the Geology of Texas textbook, this is listed as one of the geologic wonders of Texas, and it's because they use so much of this native stone, this Goliad Formation, to create this giant fort, including the churches, and I believe they use the same rock as well, the same Goliad Formation for some of the missions in the area. So this rock, this Goliad Formation, really allowed for the early European settlers to be successful here by using what was the local geology. Again, always fascinated by where geology and human history intersect. And this is a great example of that. So I'm actually standing on one of the battlements, and I just wanted to show what the rocks look like that they were using for the fort material. So most of this is actually sandstone, and it's actually a gravelly sandstone, which tells me that this would have come out of an ancient riverbed or probably ancient river system. Now, what's interesting about this rock is it's actually known as the Goliad Formation, and it's somewhere between, let's say, 13 million to 5 to 8 million years old. They've actually found a number of really interesting fossils within this formation as well. Now, of course, there's a quarry not far from here. I'm going to see if I can go visit that quarry, and we can see where maybe some of the rocks came from to build this quite impressive fort behind me that was actually initially built in the 1700s and then rebuilt again in the 1800s, and of course more recently rebuilt again and repaired as part of the preservation of this. But all of that and all those forts were a combination of wood and what is known as this Goliad sandstone. In fact, we can see how well lithified some of these things are, that this looks like it should be flaky, but it's not. But this is all this coarse sandstone as part of the Goliad Formation. And what's pretty neat to see on some of these pieces is we can actually see what's known as cross bedding. And so again, this tells me this is from some kind of water motion. So you get these little cross beds as water's flowing along a stream. This can also happen along shorelines. Seeing this really tells me it's more from a river type system, or something we say in geology is fluvial. Now, as I approach this wall, initially there would have been some kind of plaster over the top of this, and you can see they basically made a cement or plaster out of, it looks like gravel and some other rocks and probably some limestone to create that material. But you can still see underneath it these coarse gravels and sandstone that are part of the Goliad Formation. Now, another interesting thing to know is that the Goliad Formation is actually the formation that Houston gets its water out of, and I believe it's called the Evangeline Aquifer. So this really tells you about the extent of some of the geology, and as a geologist, the areas and the vast areas we have to think about when we're thinking about these depositional systems or about these rocks and how they were deposited. So the Evangeline is the aquifer for the Houston area, and that's about 2.5 hours from here, so well over 100 miles. And it gives you an idea about how regionally extensive this fluvial system was. There's a whole series of rivers pouring down from the north, probably from the highlands associated around Austin, kind of in the Miocene period, draining those highlands down towards the old Gulf of Mexico. And these are those river deposits that are, around 10, let's say 10 million years old, that were lithified and captured, and now of course become part of the fort here and the aquifer for Houston, Texas. I prefer to see rocks and outcrop and where they belong. It is neat being able to take a look at this and see what we call cross beds. So this is where water was flowing, and I get an idea about the flow direction. But not just that, is I can see the gravels here. So just from this one block, I can tell you that I was in a higher energy system, likely water, because I can see some semi-rounded pebbles in here. And I was probably in some kind of river system because I needed some way to travel and carry this water. And we know the Gulf of Mexico was to the south of us from here, and we had highlands by Austin north of us. So there's rivers draining from the north to the south, and these are probably capturing some of these rivers during that Miocene period. And here's a real nice look at some of those gravels. So you can see my finger and fingernail for scale, so you can get an idea about these semi-rounded gravels. So these probably didn't travel too far, but it does show me that whatever deposited the Goliad Formation had to have some energy associated with it. I'm sure you all have seen pebbly beaches at lakes or little pebbles along streams, and that's what is being captured within this Goliad Formation. Now, as a building material from a quarry, these didn't always break out as nice single blocks. So they had very variable shapes to them that they would have to fit these together. Now, there are some where they did have some nice, I'll say more rectangular shapes, and they use those more decoratively above doors, around doorways. And I'll show you one of those in a second. But you can see the different sizes of the blocks from here to this little one, to looking at these various block sizes and shapes, that these weren't all cut to be equal in size or equal size. They really were working with whatever they can grab from that quarry and start putting together and starting to cement between them. And you can see all the different sizes here. You can see above the door here where they had more of these almost rectangular shapes, and they try to be a little bit more decorative, but you'll look at all the variability just in the rocks from, you have these straight line ones that are a little coarser grain to finer grain with no real structure with it, to very gravelly, to even more gravelly, to cross beds, and some lateral planing and some horizontal planing. And you continue to see, so you can build a whole story with just looking at these blocks about what the geology must have been that first laid these down. And from a construction point of view, they had to get really creative when building this fort and building these buildings, because much like, if you remember, people remember the game of Tetris, they were going to have to adjust and fit these all in. But these aren't these nice, beautiful squares that you think of as in a normal quarry. So literally across the street from La Bahía is this outcrop of the Goliad Formation. And we can get an idea how thick it is here. Now, I've read it could be up to about 250 feet thick. I am along a road, so I'm going to move my way in here. But here you can get an idea about some of the layers. So it looks like you have a nice channel deposit and some muddier stuff that's in here, and then another nice channel deposit. So what happens is these rivers are flowing. Of course, they flow for a while, they eventually shut down or they shift, especially for meandering systems. And then you get these mud drapes that come on top. And so you're really recording this fluvial history within this outcrop. And this is probably one of the areas they could have gotten rocks from, but I would guess they're probably going to be more likely to get it from along the river, because of course this was cut because of the road here, and I'm not sure how exposed this would have been at the time. But the river is your natural excavator, and of course the early settlers here, including even the indigenous people, probably used the rocks along the river to build homes and to build, of course, the fort across the street. One of the reasons the Presidio La Bahía was put here was to protect the mission Nuestra Señora del Espíritu Santo de Zuniga that's here just on the other side of La Bahía. And unfortunately, I'm here after they've closed, in the sense of the visitor center's closed. But let me see if we can walk around a little bit, and more importantly, I want to take a look at the old quarry here. So it is an absolutely beautiful church. Let's see if by chance it's still open. Unfortunately, it's closed, and I'm sure you'll notice I put a hat on. It gets a little toasty out here as you get to this area of central Texas and on a warm May weekend. So I've moved from the Presidio La Bahía over to the Espiritu Mission, which is why La Bahía, the Presidio, was built in the first place. And you'll see they're also using the same rock formation what's known as the Goliad Formation, again here. Now, what I understand is there's actually a quarry here we can look at. So let's go look at that quarry. And then what I want to do is try to find maybe the quarry that would be close to La Bahía, so we can take a look at that as well. So they don't have a lot of information about the different buildings, but you can see the remains of some of the original architecture from the mission in the 1700s here. So if you ever visit the mission here, we're going to walk down what's known as the Aranama Trail, and we're going to see if we can find the quarry. I heard there's one down here. So I read it's about a quarter-mile hike, pretty easy to work your way through. They have little informational signs along the way. This one says ancient river, ancient land. And we know there are ancient rivers here because right now I am walking on top of what is the Goliad Formation, which, as we talked about before, is an ancient river system that was preserved from somewhere between 5 and 13 million years ago in this area. I am guessing I'm going to go down these stairs and hopefully see the quarry, because I can see all the rocks starting to crop out along this path. And look at that oak tree. I know I'm here to talk about the rocks, but check out that amazing oak tree. Wow. All right, so this would have been a kiln used for hardening the sandstone, it said. And so they'd shovel sand into this feature, create basically bricks here. So I think we have found one of the quarries. In fact, you can see maybe where they dug out here. So it sounds like they actually ground some of this stuff down to make actual proper bricks, but they also quarried this, as we saw, and used just the raw material to haul out. Pretty cool to see this. What a neat area. I will say this is a very picturesque spot, and you can see how they carved out all the material in here. And now for the geology, this is a great spot where you can see the crossbeds from the river system, as well as the gravels that got caught up in the river system as well. Really neat to see this in this kind of cross-sectional view. Pretty spectacular. And one of the reasons probably the early settlers worked along the creeks is because of stuff like this, where the river would actually carve the edges of the stone. They'd eventually fall down, and so all they had to do was collect it and use, sticks or wheels or animals to move the blocks to the mission or to the Presidio La Bahía. My guess is they had another area much closer to the Presidio to pull rocks than this. This probably was the perfect spot. In fact, I believe they reused these rocks in this quarry to fix up the mission here, using the same rocks from this area. Now, the Presidio is a little bit of a distance from here. There's a little bit of topography, and make a lot more sense for them to work along the San Antonio River as opposed to kind of this creek that's behind me. So from that quarry to here, and you can see the similarity in the rocks that we saw in that quarry, as well as in this wall. So one thing I don't understand, maybe somebody can answer for me, is it said they built a kiln there in 1749, and then another one, recreation, in 1935 by the CCC. And I'm curious because everything I look around here, when I look at the walls, I look at all the structures, they're all just raw rock. There's not a lot of what I consider brick, which is why I figured you do a kiln. So I don't know if there's something else that was happening here that you all can inform me about, but I'm curious to know. Let me know in the comments down below if you know more about the story, why they had a kiln here, and they said they were grinding up sand. I'm assuming they were making bricks out of it, but I don't see any bricks anywhere here or anything that doesn't look pretty much all natural. So just behind me on the other side of this fence, I think, is the quarry where they got their stone from, La Bahía. It looks like it's been worked for a long time. The river's naturally cut through, and it'd be an obvious place for the early settlers here to come down and get rock to build the fort. Pretty interesting. All right, everybody. Well, I'm pretty excited to find this. So I'm along, I believe it's the San Antonio River, and this very well may be part of the area where they're excavating rocks to build the Presidio. So this would be an obvious place to come grab material to build that. So I can see why this area would be prime for collecting rocks for La Bahía up the road, because you're right next to the river. The river's done a lot of the sculpting for you. Now you just need to get the rocks and move them up and out. So from this vantage point, you can really see the sandstone. In fact, you can see the striae dipping down away from us. So these are going to be those cross beds that I was talking about. And this looks very, very similar to the types of rocks we were seeing in the Presidio. And you can actually see the different layers of them. And here you go. Here's some of that nice cross bedding we saw in the Presidio with kind of the more massive, what we call massive look, less cross bedding going on. But this is a nice view of the rock in its natural state, where it came from, that was used to build the Presidio. And again, this is known as the Goliad Formation. And it's obviously been named because we're in the town of Goliad, and this extends across much of Texas. We can see this as an ancient fluvial system, probably not too dissimilar from the modern day river system we can see down here, draining all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. So what does that tell me about the history of Texas? Well, that tells me that the central part of Texas has been draining for a really long time, which is probably why it's generally pretty flat. There are hills here, but there are no mountains, because all the material that would make up the mountains over millions and millions of years, tens of millions of years, has all been eroded down. And like here, it's been deposited as a series of fluvial systems or rivers, and it's continuing to happen today, which is nice to see that juxtaposition from an ancient river system to the modern river system over on the other side. So as we look across at the rocks there, you can see again the cross bedding that's occurring. But one thing I want you to notice is I mentioned this is the aquifer for Houston, so it's known as the Goliad Formation or aquifer. And all the sandstone, including the sandstone right below me, has a lot of what we call porosity. So it can hold a lot of water, but not just that, but it actually can move a lot of water. We call it permeability, the ability of water to flow through rocks. So these rocks are perfect for that. The Goliad aquifer looks anything like this. I imagine that we get pretty good water out of those sections of the Goliad Formation. As I'm looking around within the sandstone, I'm actually seeing pieces of bone. So here's a piece of bone from some kind of Miocene creature that lived along the river, died, and then its remains floated down this river, around 10 million years ago. But there are pieces of bone within the Goliad Formation. Now, those are bones that you can't really collect because they're lithified or they're solidly in place within the rock. But it is pretty cool being able to see some pieces of fossils within this fluvial system. Tell me, not only do we have a nice old river system, but we had a river system that had life around it, which is what we'd expect, but it's nice seeing proof of that. All right, so I walked around and we were able to take a look at a bunch of the geology here. Point out a couple of things. One, you can see the nice cross section and the old river, and I was able to show that juxtaposition here between these rivers from the Miocene, which are somewhere, let's say around 10 million years ago, and the modern day river. But it's not just that, but what's fascinating about this area is there's actually fragments of bones. Now, some of these bones are probably more modern, but there are also some older bones I saw in this area, and just little bone fragments that are starting to erode out from this area. So I'm not sure which of these are actually fossilized. So there are pieces like this that are clearly fossilized and are from the Miocene, and I don't know what this belongs to, but it was just in some float here and some loose gravel, and you can see there are definitely fossils here. And I picked up this one just to show you. I'll put it back. All right, so check this out. So I stopped by where they were working on a fossil dig, and here is either a mammoth or mastodon tusk they found within the Goliad Formation. I'm so excited about seeing this. And so they're working with actually a paleontologist and geologist out of Victoria College, where I went and did a tour, and I'll link their museum up above here. But they were actually working with a scientist out of there trying to preserve a number of these. Pretty fascinating. And I don't want to get too close, but this thing is probably about 3 or 4 feet long. From this vantage point on top of the Goliad Formation in sandstone, I want to say thank you all for joining me today. Thank you to my new friends I met who own this property that let me walk around and who let me explore it some and talk about the geology and see some of the bones and fossils that they're finding here that they're donating to museums. Really fascinating. With that being said, you all know what to do. Please subscribe if you enjoy my videos. Keep up on all my adventures. Hit that bell for notifications with your subscription. Please give it a thumbs up on this video if you enjoyed it. Please leave comments down below. I like to hear what you're thinking, and if you all knew about the Goliad Formation, knew this was the aquifer for Houston, did you know it went this far over, or that they're finding fossils out of this stuff, these old mammals and crocodiles and turtles out of these things? Absolutely fascinating. So with that being said, goodbye and take care.